In this video, we're going to talk about foundational narratives as a foundation of power. And foundational narratives, what I call foundational narratives, and I'll explain a little bit about what that is in a second. It's important for influence warfare for two reasons. One, it's often the pivot point, it's the traction, it's how we hook many influence campaigns. Ultimately, it's the foundational narrative's successful tattooing onto the subconscious processes and phenomena that allow it to be the target for many influence campaigns. Then in addition, it also describes influence warfare at its most extreme, and that is powers, governments trying to strengthen their own foundational narratives and weaken those of competitors and adversaries. And many would consider this as a foundation of civilization itself. Again, people convincing people to follow them and not to follow others. It certainly predates armies and states and remains an imperative of power today. Now, there's a number of studies in management, archaeology, anthropology, neuroscience, for example, that suggest that we can only really know or deeply trust about 120 to 150 people in a given point in time, that our brains have not evolved to be able to interact or micromanage or directly lead or directly be able to have a day-to-day relationship with more than 120 to 150 people. There's no biological mechanism to directly manage more people. Humans have not evolved to directly bond with more people. But something interesting happened 70,000 years ago, which some scientists call the cognitive revolution, and some historians call the dawn of human history, the dawn of the history of Homo sapiens. So that is not the ability to communicate, which we already had and our cousin species already had, but the ability to communicate abstract stories, stories about things that don't exist in nature. This is long after tools and weapons and medicine, certainly early spoken language, and well after the early controlled use of fire. So these foundational narratives, some call them imagined realities, they allowed many people to unite beyond the clan, beyond that group of 120 to 150 people. So strangers could bind together in what we call today social contracts. But it's also important to note that foundational narratives also allowed clans to become more united as well. And this is where we get the ideas of statecraft and defense and strategy itself. These imagined realities, these national mythologies, these sacred values, what I call, for learning purposes, foundational narratives, they fueled shared psychological orders of how people see and view the world. They allowed many people to believe in intangible ideas, again, ideas that don't exist in nature, ideas like nation and state, money, currency, law, order, a shared history, things like equal rights, which there's no natural precedent for necessarily. It allowed the first kingdoms, the first city-states, and eventually the state system and the quote-unquote state system and post-Westphalian system that we have in some of the world today. But at its most extreme, influence warfare still sees foundational narratives as very important, as key, because it describes influence warfare, again, at its extremes. Governments strengthening their own foundational narratives, trying to tattoo those foundational shared narratives onto the subconscious processes and phenomena of their citizenry, and trying to influence, in many cases, adversaries or even competitors to abandon their own foundational narratives. So again, before 68,000 BC, we can only really know and deeply trust or micromanage, if you will, about 120 to 150 people in a given point in time. We had to know everybody within a clan to be able to cooperate. But with these foundational narratives, with these imagined stories, leaders could unite and lead in the tens and now hundreds of millions. And once these foundational narratives are accepted, and then from there we get these ideas as social constructs, we then have to defend those foundational narratives. We defend those foundational narratives that are buttressing or the pillars of today's social contracts. As Kissinger said, those under assault are challenged oftentimes to defend themselves physically, but they also have to defend themselves, that is, defend the basic assumptions of their way of life, their moral right to exist, and to act in a manner that, until the challenge, have been treated as beyond question. So people have to, again, defend the logic or the ideas behind foundational narratives. As Yuval Harari says, an imagined order is always in danger of collapse because it depends upon myths. And myths vanish when people simply stop believing them. He goes on to say, in order to safeguard an imagined order, continuous, diligent, and conscious efforts are imperative. So foundational narratives, it's a paradox. At one point, if they're successful, they really do help shape how people see the world. On the other hand, it's something that's seen also as a possible critical vulnerability that we see leaders trying to buttress, trying to strengthen in their own countries, in their own nations. So foundational narratives are inherently fragile, and this is why we see strategic leaders go out of their way to strengthen said foundational narratives, to strengthen those core values through things like culture and education and rituals and rites and laws, norms, laws, etc., religious laws, etc. Now, when successful, your citizens and your soldiery, they will internalize these shared foundational narratives, these shared cognitive constructs. They will internalize these foundational narratives to the point where they will reject and become physically repulsed by intellectual attacks that contradict the basic assumptions behind their foundational narratives, behind those communal narratives. So maybe think to a time when someone had deeply offended you, your values, maybe your faith, your family, your service, etc., how that made you feel. And then we find that, again, the body and the way the brain works is very much in an emotional state, like we would be if we were in physical danger, if we're in danger against the assumptions, or our assumptions are in danger, those assumptions that strengthen foundational narratives. Again, a brain may act in a similar way to an intellectual attack on a person's foundational narratives as it does to a physical attack. When successful, these foundational narratives, they will affect the neural architecture of your citizens. They shape how we see and how we sense the world. And of course, the brain receives signals through a number of wavelengths. Of course, we have more than just 5 senses, but it doesn't do so in a vacuum. Instead, the brain is actively, specifically our subconscious phenomena, subconscious processes that we study within neurobiology and related fields. The brain is actively and predictively generating guesses to try to make sense of the world every moment we live through our life. And these guesses are predicated on those foundational understandings and how we view the world, how we view history, how we view time, how we view the value of human life. Our minds are actively generating the world. And it's Minnow that goes on to say that he claims that 95% what goes on our awareness is our subconscious exerts a huge influence on our lives, and beginning with making our lives possible. That even the most reasonable thoughts, the thoughts that we think are very logic and part of our slow thinking, etc., our most reasonable thoughts and actions mainly result from automatic, unconscious processes. At the very least, we know that subconscious phenomena and processes at least influence behavior and decisions. And in some cases, perhaps they do help to determine what those behaviors and decisions might be. Now, all this complexity of how the brain works, and that is those foundational narratives that have successfully tattooed themselves onto the subconscious, they generate what we call the entirety of what we would call culture and history making and civilization, for example. This is something that Miguel Nogales talks about a lot. That this is David Eagleman, that consciousness, the thing that flickers to life when you wake up, that's the smallest bit of what is happening in the brain. It's something that rides on top of massive amounts of machinery. The idea, again, is even some of our most reasonable thoughts appear to be majorly influenced or perhaps determined by our subconscious minds, which have been tattooed by certain narratives that we're calling foundational narratives in this video. Thanks.